Well, hey everybody, thanks for joining. I wanted to do something a little different than what we usually do. I know so many of you know my faith. I talk about it, and I talk about kind of the role that that's played, some of the struggles I've had with the faith, and in terms of politics and what I was raised, what I believe, and so I really wanted to have somebody on today that can, both talk about that kind of from his perspective, kind of help folks that obviously many of you don't share the same faith I do, but you have an interest in how this has kind of played a role in what you're seeing in the politics. So I want to bring him on, and he's actually a special friend of mine. So he used to be my pastor at the church I go to in Houston here, and recently took a new job as a professor. His name's Steve Bezner. He's a longtime pastor, currently serves as the associate professor of pastoral ministry and theology at Truett Seminary at Baylor University. He's the author of a really good book. It's called Your Jesus is Too American, Calling the Church to Reclaim Kingdom Values Over the American Dream. Most recently served as senior pastor of Houston Northwestern Church from 2013 till 2025. And his passion is to see the world become more like heaven as people become more like Jesus. Steve, how you doing, man? Good to see you.
I'm doing great, Adam. Thanks for having me on today. I appreciate
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, you bet. So one of the things I want to tell people is you have a new Substack now, and you want to talk a little about that and kind of like why you decided to do that, what you're writing about, because people that, maybe only interested in the horse race of politics, maybe they're like, oh, I don't want, but there are a lot of people that are part of this Substack that are especially interested in, a lot of them share our faith, but a lot are specifically interested in kind of the nuance of I guess the details behind politics. Talk a little bit about what you're writing about and why you decided to start that.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I just really felt like there was kind of this move where religion is playing a larger and larger role in the public square, particularly within the political realm. And I think that there's a lot of conversation surrounding what the role of that ought to be. I particularly think that there's a lot of confusion regarding specifically evangelical Christians on whether that should be a role that they try to take charge, take dominion, or if it ought to be a space where they take a posture where they're inviting people to be part of the conversation who are not Christian. And so I really just wanted to try to bring my perspective and theological kind of background to bear on those sorts of things. And so I'm trying to write about that. And then from time to time, I'll talk about other just sort of general pastoral issues that are specific to the Christian faith, but I think help give perspective and color to the political conversation as well.
Yeah, and I think that's what's important is again, because I get asked, I mean, probably almost literally every interview I do, I get asked, how did the Republican Party get here? How did the church get here? How did whatever? And I think for folks that really want to understand that, it's important to see, particularly the Republican Party, I think largely through the lens of evangelical Christianity. I mean, I think back to prior to 2016, so prior to Trump's election. I mean, until the death of Scalia, I actually think, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I felt like the church was either more neutral on Trump or even in some cases an adversary a little bit. They looked at his personal life and everything else, and Scalia died, and that changed everything because now you had this deciding vote on abortion. Trump probably very smartly from his perspective said, I'm gonna put a pro-life Supreme Court nominee in there. And then, we went through all the way through the grab them by the stage. And the church went from kind of, I think, acquiescent to sort of supportive to today, I would call it enabling. Is that kind of how you see it? When I say the church here, I'm not talking about every church, obviously, and I'm not talking about, our church. I'm not, but I'm going to say kind of generically when I say the church, it's this kind of broader evangelical movement. When you think about the Jerry Falwells and stuff like that, how do you kind of see that and how that developed?
Totally agree with what you just said, Adam. A lot of this is laid out in a book called Jesus and John Wayne that Kristen Dumais wrote. But basically that relationship between the GOP and the evangelical church has been really growing closer and closer since the 1980s, kind of the Reagan era. You mentioned Jerry Falwell, moral majority, all that kind of stuff. But something unique kind of shifted in the 2016 election surrounding Trump. I don't know that I'm able to place my finger on a significant instance. You mentioned the death of Scalia. I had never considered that before. That makes sense. But there's no doubt that before Trump got the nomination and even through the first election, there were vocal leaders who rejected Trump as the nominee because they saw his personal behavior, particularly the fact, he would mock disabled people, his sexual escapades, these kinds of things that would have been disqualifying in the past, and they rejected him. But sometime between 2016 and 2020, 2024, that support just continued to grow. I don't know exactly what has caused that. I will say that I do think that on the left, the Democratic Party moving more and more into identity politics, moving more and more to quote unquote wokeism, moving more and more towards kind of those sorts of issues, I think caused an inflection point among a lot of just sort of average Americans. And I think that the Republican Party sensed that, and they tried to seize the moment to a degree of success, obviously. And I think that Trump, for my perspective, really just plays to what makes sense in the moment. He's really kind of the true politician, not thinking about philosophy or any kind of conviction. He just says, what do the people want? And then he goes after it. And I think he really sensed what the moment was, and particularly among evangelical Christians, and he went after it.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's interesting. So my wife, you know her, but she worked for the RNC. This is prior to Trump actually getting the nomination. And in fact, she was one of the few that actually stayed at the RNC because she had a real passion for Hispanic outreach for Republicans, and that was her project. But she had mentioned how kind of leading up to, when we were going through and I was a big Jeb Bush guy. Gosh, if we could only have like him back, I mean, that would be great. But, going through that time period of that primary, she was talking about how the RNC was really put a lot of effort in putting a coalition of pastors together, of pastors that would pray on the phone, that would, you began to do this kind of grassroots movement of pastors for whoever the eventual Republican nominee was going to be. And when it became Trump, the RNC made the decision because, there was I remember specifically during that time, there was discussion about should the RNC basically unsupport Donald Trump? Should they disown him? Should they pull support from him, particularly after the Access Hollywood comments? And instead, they made the decision that they were going to give all this to Donald Trump. And so now they move over this giant network of pastors to Donald Trump, who then is really good at, I'll honestly say, manipulating or understanding kind of, in my mind, the lizard brain of the situation. He knows people's fears. He knows how to stoke them. He knows, there's Jonathan Cahn, who's an author. I think he's Messianic Judaism, and he wrote this book called The Paradigm or something like that. And it's about how King Ezra, is that a king? King Ezra? King somebody, basically looks just like Donald Trump, and how, God used this king in the Old Testament, and he's using Donald Trump the same way. And it married religion and politics. So that to me was kind of, like you said, there was a moment at which he was able to manipulate that and take people's fears. What's your thoughts on, I guess, on some of that, but also on, should a political party, is it good or bad? Should a political party be out there trying to put pastors together as a grassroots coalition for a political candidate? What do you think about that? And not only just what do you think about that, has your thinking evolved on that over time?
Oh man, it has moved a lot. I think that the single issue voter surrounding abortion has really been kind of the linchpin in the relationship between the evangelical Christian community and the GOP. And I think that for many, many years, that was really what kept a lot of folks firmly within the Republican Party. Obviously, we know that Trump's personal opinions on that are fluid at the very best. I think that we know that he did appoint pro-life justices, but at the same time, I think that his personal opinions that he said have obviously kind of been all over the place on that. So who knows exactly where he stands or what his policy would be. But the question of whether or not we ought to use pastors, I think, is kind of nuanced. So I think in one sense, yeah, it's great to bring faith communities to the table because they're citizens. They should be able to speak into the government just like anybody else. I think that if Christians don't speak into the public square, then other parties will, and the Christian voice won't be heard. At the same time, this is where I think things begin to get muddy. There's a difference between speaking into the public square and between trying to control the public square. And I think that one of the things that we have seen, and I want to be clear, this is not just in the Trump administration. I think that this has been a problem within a lot of evangelical communities over the last, let's say, 50 years, has been the desire to be close to the person in power, and as a result, selling out conviction in order to be in the White House or in the governor's mansion or whatever the sphere of government may be. And that's really been the key thing, is that whenever pastors and churches began to recognize the fact that they might get invited to the table, they took the bait and went a little too far. I'm sure you're familiar with that term, useful idiot. I'm not calling
Mm-hmm.
anybody an idiot. I'm not trying to say that. I just think that a lot of times what I'm seeing over the last decade specifically are folks who serve in pastoral roles who have been used as props rather than being actual advisors. And there is a difference. There's a difference between being used for a photo op and a difference between that and being invited to the table to visit with folks about actual policy decisions. And that's the thing that I'm worried that we're doing right now, is that we're being used rather than being consulted.
Yeah, I mean, it was always interesting when you saw Trump's speech at Liberty University and he talks about 2 Corinthians. I mean, anybody that's ever even been to a Bible reading, much less been to a church service, knows it's Second Corinthians, right? And or when he stands in front of the church after the BLM, after they broke up the BLM protest, and holds the Bible, you can see that he uses it as a prop. And the crazy thing, I still think back to, because as you know, and probably many watching know, I had a whole section of my family that disowned me during the January 6th stuff, and they sent a certified letter, and it got in the New York Times. I didn't release it there. They sent it to the New York Times, so they wanted this to be known far and wide. But in it, it calls me, a member of the devil's army. Trump may not be perfect, but he's a Christian. And it's like, so I see that and I read it. It's like right out of a cult manuscript. But I read that and it's like, Donald Trump is a Christian. And I'm like, okay, Donald Trump, when he was on stage in the 2016 campaign, said, no, he hasn't asked God for forgiveness because he doesn't think he has anything to be forgiven for. And I mean, to me, that's the main tenet of the Christian faith, right? Is none of us are perfect and we have to ask God for forgiveness. But yet somehow, this has happened. And it's like, I do think, there is this, and I saw it among my old colleagues. There's this idea that there is something intoxicating about the presidency. I mean, and I can think of Mike Waltz as an example. He was very kind of aggressive against Trump until one day he flew on Air Force One with him. And from that point
Hmm.
on, I mean, obviously he became a short-lived national security advisor. There's something about that access to power. And I guess it goes to show that pastors, churches, Christians are not immune from that. I mean, we're all humans. How do you guard against, and in your life, like, how did you, I guess let's go to a broader question. How did you come to kind of the belief that you don't have to be like a hardcore Trumper, right, to be a Christian? Why don't you talk about kind of your evolution a little bit on that? And then I want to chat a little bit about your book and what inspired you to write it.
Yeah. So, I mean, when I was 18, I planned to major in political science. I've always loved politics, always been a Christian. So that was something that I really cared deeply about. And I really saw no problem with the hand in hand relationship between the evangelical church and the GOP. What I began to recognize as I got further into my life and experience in pastoring and in my theological studies, 2 things. Number one, I began to recognize that the church that's presented in scripture is not aligned with any political party's talking points, at least not in the American context. And so I think I can safely say that what we see in the pages of the New Testament does not perfectly reflect either the Democratic or the Republican Party. So having an independent mindset is actually, I think, a better, healthier thing to do for a Christian. So I think that's one of the things that I saw. The other thing that happened was I began to recognize the hypocrisy within some of the folks that I was voting for. And I just began to see that just because you would vote for them on issue A didn't mean that they actually would hold to a Christian conviction or position on issue B. Now, I understand that that's the way that politics works, and you have to have a wide coalition and all that kind of stuff. But what I finally began to recognize was that the church's role is not to primarily be a partisan force in the world, but rather is to give an alternative vision for reality and then to invite people into that. And if we can bring that influence to bear on politicians, on politics, on issues, on policies, then we certainly should do so. But we don't need to try to convince ourselves that we are going to ever be able to have, single power, a single voice in those spaces, because folks are going to do whatever they can to preserve power, and they're not necessarily looking to make sure that that's Christian power. So I think that those were a couple of things that happened. So over the years, I just really began to recognize, we have to have a good government. We have to have one that's run with integrity and honesty, or our system will not function. At the same time, the Christian church and the government cannot be synonymous, because whenever you mix church and politics, you end up with politics, you lose the church. And so I think for the church to preserve her identity, to be the conscience of the state, as MLK famously said, we have to be able to retain that prophetic voice, which means that we have to have convictions and say there's just certain things we will not move on. And we have to be willing to go into the corridors of power and then say things that might be unpopular, to say things that reflect more the values of the scripture about the poor, the indigent, the immigrant, etc.
So let me ask, and I fully agree with you on that. And where do you think, so when the vast majority of pastors, for instance, kind of get the temptation to say, I'm going to actually endorse a political candidate, right? Or because I think the role of the church, as you described it there, is like, we're not going to get into the weeds on politics in terms of, passing out the voter guides that are biased and telling you that if you don't vote for Trump, you're going to hell, or if you don't vote for Kamala, you're going to hell. It's more like, hey, here is how we do life. Here is our kind of overall overarching viewpoint on that stuff. Do you think that's maybe kind of a dumb question, but do you think most pastors started out that way and then kind of got sucked into the power of it? Or do you think is that a viewpoint that you think has been evolved from kind of this old view that politics and religion mix? Like, in essence, is that something that kind of the church is maturing into, the understanding that we're going to transcend politics to an extent, but talk about the social issues?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's all over the place, Adam. I see a lot of pastors that have been burned. They understand. They're trying to have a much more measured response. One of the things that's been hard for me to swallow has been watching younger pastors who have fallen right back into the 80s, 90s kind of mindset. I kind of thought, oh, okay, the young people won't think like that, but that's just not the case, making a lot of the same mistakes that previous generations have made. And so I think that what ends up happening is that if you have the opportunity to go into the White House, to go and experience some of that sort of power, I think that what ends up happening is that you think, oh, as long as I can keep coming here, then I can make a difference. The problem is that in order to keep the invitations coming, you have to either stay silent whenever you should be speaking out because you don't want to offend the person who would invite you back, or you have to say things that aren't completely in line with the Bible so that you'll also be invited back. And when that happens, the truth of the matter is the people who have any knowledge of the scripture, specifically of the New Testament, they immediately recognize that you've sold out. And so what ends up happening is that you lose credibility. And as you lose that credibility, then that doesn't just stop at the church door, right? Then it goes out into the community. And I really think that's one of the reasons that in a lot of ways, the evangelical church has had a credibility crisis, is because it's difficult to discover which pastors are willing to operate from a space of conviction and which are just doing so from a space of convenience.
Now, let me just ask a quick question. Which would have been easier from you outside of your beliefs or whatever as a pastor? Would it have been easier for you to be like, I'm all in on Trump and I'm going to turn my ministry into an America First ministry with Jesus kind of riding shotgun with us with his M4, on an eagle? Or has it been harder to kind of take the approach that you've taken, which is we're going to talk about values and what matters? Which would have been easier for you?
Oh, yeah. If I would have gone all in on Trump, that would have been the easiest. I mean, I'm in Texas. I would have no problem drawing an audience for that. And people love that stuff. So it's definitely been harder to take a more measured approach. What I try to do is whenever the president, whether that is Trump or Biden or before him, Obama, et cetera, whenever the president does something positive, I try to say, hey, I appreciated this. This was a good thing. And whenever the president does something that I think goes contrary to scripture, I try to say that is outside what the church teaches, outside what the New Testament teaches. That's never easy because most of us are getting our news from a partisan source, right? So they're watching MSNBC or watching Fox News, and so only hearing one set of talking points. And really, I think that a lot of Christians are being discipled, so to speak, being formed by those sorts of cable networks, by those sorts of websites. As a result, then, whenever anybody says anything that's just a little bit outside of that, you immediately classify that person as an enemy. They need to be ignored and moved on. And
Mhm.
so I think that that has been a challenge in the pulpit, because whenever you say those kinds of things, you're really trusting that your people will listen to you and trust that the scripture is greater and give that value. Now, I've been very fortunate, very blessed. My church has really received that. I will confess that there have been times where I think they were struggling to follow me on some of those points, and also some folks have decided to go elsewhere. But I think that for the most part, they have seen what I'm trying to do and they've respected that. Um, it hasn't been easy. I don't want to act like it has been, but I really do think it has been rewarding. And I would love to see more and more pastors take that kind of approach, because we're in a very important season right now in the United States. And really, honestly, I think that with the internet age getting more and more polarized, more and more divided, we need voices of faithful Christians in local spaces speaking the truth in love. And if we don't have those, then I think that things are going to get real bad real quick.
Yeah, I agree. And most people probably don't know my story that are watching this, but for basically since I started on the January 6th route, so I guess kind of after the election, until what, 6 months to I guess maybe a year ago, I didn't go to church. And
Mm,
I would go to a occasionally in DC, National Community Church. They stay pretty free of politics. And but the biggest fear I had, and same with my wife, is just we'd accidentally walk into a MAGA church, right? And then not just what do they do to me, because like fine, confront me, I don't care, but like what does that do to my faith? Because I've had to go through, in essence, and I hate the term because it's overused, but like deconstruction of my faith. What do I really believe? Why do I believe it? And I actually think kind of going through this with the church has been much better for me, because I've actually come to realize in my mind who Jesus actually is and what he
mm,
actually teaches, and that it's actually a much more positive and, as he says, his burden is easy, a much more easy thing to follow than this idea of like this angry America, like the enemy, always just you realize like Jesus actually does preach a very light message, like with light, not darkness.
mm.
And so that's been interesting for me. And so you decided, so you could have had the easy route and gone full Trump. You decided to stick to what you believe. And so on top of that, you just recently published a book called Your Jesus is Too American. So that's a controversial title in and of itself. So why don't you talk a little about what that's about, what inspired you to write that, and what you hope people take away from it?
Yeah, I noticed kind of the thing that I mentioned earlier, that a lot of the folks in my church were being discipled by Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate online. They're being discipled by Fox News, being discipled by MSNBC. And the most important message that I really wanted the people of our church to be discipled by was the Sermon on the Mount. The New Testament for sure, but really that core message of Jesus' teachings. And one of the things that I just began to notice was whenever I would teach anything that lined up with that it caused a lot of confusion, because it was so contrary, so counterintuitive to what people would hear the rest of the week. So we launched a pretty lengthy sermon series several years ago called The Backwards Way of Jesus. And we just kind of walked through the Sermon on the Mount, talked about the way that Jesus's ways are backwards from the world. And as I was preaching that series, I would say that it was really revolutionary in the life of our church. I think it really reinvigorated us. But also, I would talk to my other friends who were pastors, and they would say they were experiencing the same thing. So as I reached the end of that sermon series, it just made sense that what we needed to do was we needed to try and turn that into a resource that more pastors could use, that more churches could use. So I ended up turning it into a book, and I'm really excited about it. I think it turned out to be helpful to some friends of mine who are pastors, to some other churches. And that's what it is. It's just trying to speak to the need to hear from the values of Jesus, not the values of any one single political party or patriotism.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, Russell Moore used to always say, he goes, God promises the church will endure, but he never promises the American church that. And I,
Mm,
I thought that was interesting when I heard that, because it's like, we start to realize, like, as Americans, we kind of see the church through our own eyes, right? And so it's a question I have for you, and I know you get involved in a lot of kind of international stuff. You like traveling. You were talking even recently to me about a trip to South Africa. How do you see the health of the American church, again, generically the American church, evangelicals, compared to the world evangelicals out there? Do they see things, same thing? Are they MAGA? Are they, you know, go Donald Trump? Are they healthier? Like, how do you kind of compare what you see in the United States to what you see around the world?
Yeah, generally speaking, this is a broad generalization because there are certainly exceptions, but generally speaking, the international evangelical community is very different than the American evangelical community. The international evangelical community is often scratching its head at the American evangelical church, kind of saying, "Why are you acting that way? Why are you believing like that?" I think that specifically some of the more recent decisions in the Trump administration, for instance, the suspension of foreign aid, the apparent scheduled deportation of Afghan Christians. A lot of my friends that are international believers are puzzled by that because they would say, isn't this exactly the moment when the evangelical community in mass should rise up and should protest and say, hey, that's not something that we would support? But I would tell you that a lot of folks have stayed pretty quiet on that. So I think that that's one of those things where we see our mainline brothers and sisters, our Catholic brothers and sisters speaking out, but the evangelical church trying to figure out, can they speak out? And I think the reason is kind of what you've already talked about, Adam, which is this fear of breaking rank in allegiance to the Republican Party or to Trump or whatever the case may be. Because if you speak out on one issue, then you're immediately castigated as an enemy and you have to be cast to the side.
Yeah, I mean, it's like literally the rule is, it used to be the 80% rule. Like, generally, if you believe what I believe 80%, the rule has become you have to fall in line on everything. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
if you're on a pro Second Amendment, Facebook group and you come out for background checks, you'll be kicked out of that Facebook group because you're not
Mm-hmm.
pro Second Amendment enough. And then, but that's like, you take that Facebook group dynamic, and that's what you see all over the country now in social circles, right? You come out and say, well, maybe we shouldn't cut USAID. Maybe we should support Ukraine. And all of a sudden, you're now against Donald Trump or against whatever the MAGA thing is of the day, and it changes every day. So who knows what it is? And you get kicked out. And look, Steve, I believe that people. I've said this before. Like, I believe people fear more than they fear death. They fear being kicked out of their tribe. Because there is nothing that is more lonely and heart wrenching than that. Losing your friend group, losing your social circles. I think 9 out of 10 adults would jump in front of a train to save a kid. So do they fear death? Yes, but not to the extent that they're unwilling. But I think if when it comes to being kicked out of your tribe, it's much worse than that. I mean, it's I don't know. That's fear. That's fear. It's the role of fear out there, which is frankly what Jesus warns against probably more than anything is, fear. And so, speaking of fear, if you look kind of forward, what's your biggest fear for the church? And then what gives you the most kind of fear? But on an optimistic note, what gives you the most kind of hope or optimism for the church, for the country, whatever that is?
Yeah, so I think the fear would be that we would go through some of these things that have been kicked around in the news, the abandonment of due process, the suspension of habeas corpus, all these kinds of things, to where we would just continue the slow slide towards authoritarianism, which has obviously been the most anti-American ideal, right? You want to preserve a democratic republic. So my fear would be that the church would quietly embrace that.
And by the way, it's never been good for the church. I can't think of any authoritarian movement that a church flourished under.
No, well, and one of the problems with an authoritarian movement, Adam, you already know this, is that, I mean, at some point, a different person will be in power.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever that happens, you have no idea what they might do. But that's neither here nor there. I think that that's my fear, is that there would be a move towards authoritarianism and the church would stay silent. The hope that I have is that while there are certain pockets that seem complacent and complicit, there are plenty of folks within the evangelical movement, if you're willing to look closely, who are speaking out, who are acting from conviction. And my belief is that eventually the truth cuts through the fog. And when that happens, people begin to wake up. So I think if we just continue to hold fast to conviction, to continue to say the truth, to say the hard thing, to do that in love, then eventually there can be an awakening and a return. And so that's my hope, and that's the thing that I'm holding fast to. I mean, I guess it could be considered naive, but I call it faith. I think that Jesus eventually will break through, and that's what I'm hopeful for.
Well, that's awesome. Well, look, Steve, it was great chatting with you. Everybody, again, Steve Bezner, find him on Substack, follow him. You'll get this kind of stuff. And I just think it's really important if you want to understand the dynamics in the GOP and the dynamic, I mean, really dynamics in the world, but I think specifically when you talk about kind of that interplay between faith and politics, and as you mentioned, the discussion on the town square, follow Steve because he'll, I think, it's very eye opening on that. And get his book too. Your Jesus is Too American. I think you'll find that very useful. But Steve, it was great to chat with you, my friend, and hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.
All right. Thanks, Adam. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.